Before you listen, if you enjoy the stories and want to hear more, then please consider subscribing. Most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please take this time to subscribe. Turn on notifications so you'll never miss a story and be the first to hear. You'll also be supporting me. Thank you. I remember this day like it was yesterday, even though it was a few years ago. The day started like any other, with the typical morning announcements echoing through the PA system. Little did we know that our sleepy, small-town high school would soon be on high alert, with sirens blaring and our lives turned upside down. Let me first tell you about Tyler. Tyler was the quiet, shy kid who sat in the back of the classroom. He always had his head buried in a book and rarely spoke to anyone. At first glance, you'd probably think he was just an awkward teenager navigating the complexities of high school. But as we would soon learn, there was so much more to Tyler than met the eye. As the day progressed, the tension in the air grew, but we couldn't quite put our finger on why. The school's atmosphere felt off, like static electricity before a storm. The teachers seemed more on edge than usual, constantly checking their phones and exchanging worried glances. We were all just trying to get through our classes and make it to lunchtime. Lunch finally came and we congregated in the cafeteria, hoping that the break would help to dissipate the strange energy that had settled over the school. But as we sat there, eating our sandwiches and sharing gossip, the PA system made a sound and a voice spoke. This time, however, the voice was tense and urgent, instructing us to stay in our current locations as the school was being placed on lockdown. I felt my heart drop into my stomach. The once mundane cafeteria suddenly transformed into a scene of chaos and fear. As we huddled together, I thought about Tyler for some reason, God knows why. But I hadn't seen him all day, and I wondered if he was okay, if he was scared like the rest of us. So there we were, huddled together in the cafeteria after the PA system announced the lockdown. The atmosphere was thick with fear, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The room, which had been bustling with conversation just moments before, was now eerily quiet, with only the sound of our collective breaths filling the air. We didn't know what was going on or what was going to happen next. The uncertainty of the situation made it even more terrifying. We whispered theories about what could have caused the lockdown, but none of us dared to mention the possibility of a shooter. That was the type of thing that happened in other places, not in our small town. As the minutes ticked by, it felt like the walls of the cafeteria were closing in on us. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting eerie shadows on the faces of my classmates. I remember that I couldn't help but think about the worst-case scenarios, the horrifying images that flashed through my mind, only serving to heighten my anxiety. With each passing second, the tension grew heavier. We had no way of knowing if the danger was just outside the cafeteria doors, or if the police were already on their way to save us. We were trapped, our lives hanging in the balance, and there was nothing we could do but wait. Then we heard the distant sound of footsteps echoing through the hallways, and the air in the cafeteria grew even more still. We held our breath, not knowing if it was the police or something far worse. The footsteps grew louder, and I could feel my palms sweating as I clenched my fists in fear. I remember feeling a mixture of fear, confusion, and helplessness. As we huddled together, I noticed the way my hands were shaking, my body trembling with adrenaline. My breathing was shallow, and I struggled to take deep breaths to calm myself down. But the suffocating atmosphere made it nearly impossible. I really thought I was breathing my last breaths. Suddenly, the cafeteria door burst open, and the first glimpse of a figure in the doorway made my heart skip a beat. But relief washed over us as we realized it was a police officer, his face tense and focused. He quickly ushered us out of the building, and as we filed through the hallways, I was glancing into each classroom we passed, searching for any sign of what had caused the lockdown. When we finally made it outside, the sight that greeted us was overwhelming. Dozens of police cars, ambulances, and news crews filled the parking lot, with parents and community members waiting anxiously behind the barriers. We were quickly reunited with our families, tears streaming down our faces as we clung to our loved ones. It was later that we learned the full story. Tyler, the quiet, awkward kid, had been the one to bring a gun to school that day. He had been apprehended before he could act on his plan, and though nobody had been hurt, it was impossible to escape the feeling that we had just narrowly escaped a tragedy. The memory of that day still haunts me. The fear, the confusion, and the realization that our lives could have been so easily shattered. The image of Tyler, a boy we had all known and dismissed as harmless, carrying a weapon with the potential to destroy so many lives. We were lucky that day, but the experience left us with a chilling reminder of how fragile our sense of safety can be. I can still recall the day our school in Texas went on lockdown, and it's a day that really haunts me. It's a day I'll never forget, etched into my memory like a scar that refuses to fade. The morning began like any other, with the usual hustle and bustle of students finding their way to their first class, the hum of conversation filling the halls. Nobody had any idea that our lives were about to change forever. As I sat in my second period math class, I remember the sun streaming through the windows, casting a warm glow on the whiteboard. Our teacher droned on about equations and formulas, and I tried to focus on the task at hand, but my mind couldn't help but wander to the upcoming weekend. Suddenly, the school's PA system came to life, and the principal's voice sounded panicked and on edge. She announced that the school was going into immediate lockdown and instructed everyone to stay in their classrooms, lock the doors, and hide. We all froze in our seats, the weight of her words sinking in. Our teacher quickly locked the door and turned off the lights, urging us to move away from the windows and take cover under our desks. The air in the classroom grew thick with fear, and we could hear the muffled sound of our own hearts pounding our ears. We huddled together, unsure of what was happening, our minds racing with terrifying possibilities. The silence was suddenly shattered by the distant sound of gunshots, followed by screams echoing through the halls. It was the sound that would haunt me for years to come. My stomach churned, and I felt as if I were going to be sick. We knew that something terrible was happening, and the thought of our friends and classmates in danger was almost too much to bear. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as we lay there under our desks, our bodies pressed close together, trying to find some sense of comfort in our shared terror. My mind raced trying to piece together what was happening outside our classroom, my thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. Minutes felt like hours as we waited praying for the nightmare to end. Eventually, we heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder and closer, until the wail of the police and emergency vehicles filled the air. The relief of knowing that help was on the way was indescribable, but it did little to quell the fear that still gripped us. The sound of gunshots continued to ring out sporadically, each one like a punch to the gut, a reminder of the violence happening just beyond our classroom door. We had this bad feeling and wondered if the shooter would find their way to us, if the thin wooden door was all that stood between us and certain death. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the gunshots stopped. The silence that followed was almost as unnerving as the violence that preceded it. We held our breath, waiting for a sign that it was over, that we were safe. The police eventually made their way to our classroom, their faces grim and tight-lipped. They ushered us out of the room, instructing us not to look around, but it was impossible to ignore the devastation that lay before us. The once familiar hallways were transformed into a scene of horror, with bloodstains and shattered glass littering the floor. As we were led outside, we were met by a sea of panicked faces, tearful reunions, and the deafening sound of news helicopters hovering overhead. It was then that we learned the horrifying details of what had occurred. The shooter had entered the school library with a rifle, firing indiscriminately at the students within. 4 people had been seriously injured, and 2 had lost their lives in the senseless attack. The police had ultimately been forced to shoot the attacker, putting an end to the carnage. The reality of the situation began to sink in, and a wave of grief washed over me. The faces of the injured and deceased classmates haunted my thoughts, and the knowledge that we had been so close to the violence was chilling. Our school, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt tainted by tragedy. In the days that followed, our community came together in mourning and solidarity. Vigils were held for the victims, their names and faces a painful reminder of the lives cut short by senseless violence. We tried to make sense of what had happened, to find some way to cope with the reality that our lives had been forever changed. Our school was closed for several days as investigators combed through the scene, and the building was cleaned and repaired. When we finally returned, the atmosphere was tense, the halls filled with a mix of sadness, fear, and anger. It was difficult to focus on our studies, our minds constantly drifting back to the events that had unfolded in the very place we were now expected to learn and grow. As the weeks turned into months, our school tried to find a new normal. Security measures were tightened and counselors were made available to help us process the trauma we had experienced. But the truth was, there was no going back to the way things were before. The memories of that day were etched into our minds, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that can lurk just beneath the surface. I remember that fateful day like it was yesterday. I woke up to the sound of my alarm, groggily hitting snooze a couple of times before finally dragging myself out of bed. The morning routine was just like any other. As I walked to school, the air was filled with the laughter and chatter of students excited for the day ahead. Little did we know that everything was about to change. That morning, I found myself in English class, feeling a bit drowsy as we studied Shakespeare. The words on the page seemed to blur together as I daydreamed about the upcoming weekend plans with my friends. The atmosphere in the room was relaxed and carefree, and nothing could have prepared us for what was about to happen. Suddenly, the school's announcement system crackled and broadcasted, and the principal's voice had filled the room. I could sense the urgency in her tone, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as she announced that the school was going into lockdown. She ordered us to stay in our classrooms, lock the doors, and find cover. The room went dead silent, and the weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Our English teacher, usually so composed, sprang into action, locking the door and turning off the lights. She directed us to huddle together in the corner of the room, farthest from the door and out of sight from the windows. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as fear took hold, and I couldn't help but wonder if this was some sort of sick joke or if something genuinely dangerous was happening. As we sat there in the darkness, time seemed to slow down, and the only sound was our collective breathing. We exchanged nervous glances, trying to glean information from one another, but none of us had any answers. The air was thick with tension, and I remember how my hands were shaking as I clutched my phone, wanting to call my parents, but knowing that I couldn't risk making a sound. Suddenly, we heard a loud crash from somewhere else in the school, followed by the distant sound of shouting. My heart raced, and I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. The noise was impossible to ignore, and it confirmed our worst fears. Something was terribly wrong. As we sat there listening to the chaos outside our classroom, our minds raced with terrifying possibilities. Was it a shooter? A hostage situation? The uncertainty was unbearable, and I remember feeling sick to my stomach with fear. The minutes dragged on like hours as we continued to hear sounds from the hallways, footsteps, doors slamming, and more shouting. Each new noise sent a jolt of adrenaline coursing through our bodies, and the fear became almost unbearable. I tried to keep my thoughts from spiraling, but it was nearly impossible not to imagine the worst. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we heard the sound of sirens approaching in the distance. The tension in the room seemed to lessen ever so slightly as we realized that help was on the way. But with the arrival of the police, new fears emerged. Would the situation escalate further? Would we be caught in the crossfire? As we continued to come together in our corner, we heard the sounds of police officers entering the building and making their way through the halls. The fear and anticipation were almost unbearable, and I could hardly breathe. At long last, there was a knock on our classroom door, followed by the reassuring voice of a police officer. Our teacher carefully unlocked the door, and we were greeted by the sight of several armed officers in the hallway. They quickly ushered us out of the room and down the hallway, directing us not to look back. As we hurried through the halls, I didn't want to, but in the end, I glanced at the scene unfolding around us. The once familiar surroundings now felt alien and ominous, as doors hung open with police officers securing each room. The air was heavy with tension and fear, and I felt an overwhelming urge to escape the confines of the building. When we finally made it outside, the bright sunlight seemed blinding after spending so long in the darkness. We were led to a nearby field where other students and staff were gathered, and I desperately scanned the crowd for familiar faces. Relief washed over me as I spotted my friends, but that relief was quickly replaced by the crushing weight of the reality that had just unfolded. As we huddled together on the field, news of what had transpired began to spread. It turned out that a former student had entered the school with a weapon intent on causing harm. In the chaos that ensued, several students and staff members had been injured. While the police had managed to apprehend the individual, the damage had already been done. The impact of this horrifying event was felt deeply within our school community. In the days and weeks that followed, we struggled to come to terms with what had happened. The school offered counseling services to help students and staff process the trauma, and many of us leaned on each other for support. Our once safe and familiar school had been transformed into a place of fear and anxiety. We found ourselves constantly on edge, jumping at every unexpected noise and feeling a sense of nervousness that never seemed to dissipate. The experience had shattered our sense of security and left us grappling with the knowledge that our lives had been changed forever. Thanks for listening in. If you like these stories and want to hear more, then please subscribe and like and support this new channel. We have more stories for you to listen to.